Hello, everyone. My name is Horal Qasimi. I'm president of the Africa Institute and the Sharjah Art Foundation in Sharjah in the United Arab Emirates. We're pleased to hold this webinar today. I'd like to welcome all our registered participants to the first in a series of screening programs organized by the Africa Institute in collaboration with Sharjah Art Foundation and the Royal College of Art in London. The programs are driven by the educational mission of the collaborating institutions as a contribution to the understanding through film and art of the recent protest movement across the globe against anti-Black racism. They also explore the African and Black intellectual traditions through the contributions of specific figures to critical theory and the humanities. Today's webinar focuses on the work of acclaimed Ghanaian-British artist and filmmaker John Akomfrah. It also concludes this first program with a discussion after making 3 of his films, Handsworth Songs, The March, and the Stuart Hall Project, available to stream through the Africa Institute's website for the last 4 days. Just a few notes about today's webinar before I start introducing the speakers. This webinar is currently being live streamed on the Africa Institute's YouTube channel and will also be posted there with Arabic subtitles. We will take questions from the audience through the Q&A section at the bottom of your screens, and we'll try our best to answer as many as possible. It's with great pleasure that I welcome our speakers for today. We have filmmaker John Akomfrah, whose works are characterized by their investigation into memory, post-colonialism, temporality, and aesthetics, and often explore the experiences of migrant diasporas globally. Akomfrah was a founding member of the influential Black audio film collective, which started in London in 1982 alongside David Lawson and Lena Gopal, who he still collaborates with today. Ghislaine Tawadros, who is the chief executive at DAX London, UK. Ghislaine has spent her career in the visual arts. She was the founding director of the Institute of International Visual Arts, INNOVA, in London, chaired by Professor Stuart Hall, which over a decade achieved an international reputation as a groundbreaking cultural agency at the leading edge of artistic and cultural debates nationally and internationally. Adrian Lahoud, who is the Dean of the School of Architecture at the Royal College of Art in London. His work critically examines concepts of scale and shelter in architecture in light of emancipatory, urban, and environmental struggles, focusing on the Middle East and Africa. He was research fellow on the Forensic Architecture Project and head of the MA Research Architecture at Goldsmiths University. He also curated the first edition of the Sharjah Architecture Triennial, which took place in 2019. I'd like to thank you all for accepting our invitation to this program and taking the time to do this. And I'll let you start with your conversation.
Okay. Ghislaine, would you like to start? Or would you like me to start? First of all, thank you very much.
Where should we take this?
It's humbling to be here alongside all of you.
You know, just to say that I've known Ghislaine forever, and we've talked in a variety of settings, but I'm not sure we've ever done a formal one like this, have we?
No, I don't think we have, John.
Which is so bizarre. Adrian I've known equally forever, but we've spoken quite a few times already. So I'm hoping this will be interesting and fun for everyone. Thank you both for agreeing to do this with me anyway.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Pleasure and privilege. I'm happy to kick off, Adrian, if you'd like me to. John, one of the pleasures of doing this is having an excuse to sit and watch your films over again. Even though I've seen many of them before, it was really lovely to have a period of intense, and I hope people participating today have had a chance to do that too. And if not, I believe the films are going to be on until one more day at least, I think today. So do watch them if you haven't. But what I was doing, which I hadn't done before, was trying to draw together some themes in your work, John, and some of the things that really, and I was doing this, of course, with the backdrop of what's been going on in the world over the last few months, and in particularly the Black Lives Matter protests in response to the killing of George Floyd. And so inevitably, I wanted to begin with the beginning and ending sequence in Handsworth's Songs, which was made in 1986 in response and as a poetic response to the riots in the district of Birmingham called Handsworth, which is a racially mixed area of Birmingham in the middle of England. And there is a chilling sequence at the beginning of the film of a young Black man weaving, zigzagging in the road, running away from 5 armed policemen in riot gear. And they catch him, they hold him, they press down upon him, they use their riot shields and press all the combined force of their bodies down on his single body. And that sequence, watching that sequence in the context of recent weeks was very powerful. But equally powerful was the fact that that sequence repeats itself at the end of the film. So you have this sense of the circularity of history, of what a Black woman who's at one point in the film, she's a resident of Handsworth, she's being harassed by journalists to narrate the story of the riots. And she says, there are no stories in the riots, only the ghosts of other stories. And I was thinking about that in relation to something that Stuart Hall, as a really important Black intellectual whose work I think greatly influenced Handsworth's Songs and much of your work, John, as it has mine, since we were both privileged enough to know and work with Stuart, was this idea of the conjuncture of a moment in time, and how do you make sense of the historical moment in which you find yourself? And Stuart, took this idea of the conjuncture from the Italian political theorist and writer Antonio Gramsci, but he articulated in a way, and he does it in the Stuart Hall project when he says, that the conjuncture you find yourself is never entirely new. It's always made up of things that have happened in the past with elements of newness in them. So there's never a complete break from history, but we come back to history again with these memories, with these traces of what's gone before, and yet it's never quite the same again. And I wondered if maybe we should start our conversation there.
Yes, why not? It's a very good place. Three things, two very brief and one maybe not so brief. You are, of course, right to highlight in very bold colors the name of Stuart Hall, and to stress his importance to both of us, because of course that is now a matter of record. But I think the question of conjuncture that you raised, both in relation to Antonio Gramsci's work and Stuart's, is important to note now, precisely because my feeling is that what we are always looking at, and this is something I learned indirectly from Stuart, are motifs and narratives which have unending familiarity to us because, of course, they're repetitions, as he says, but come usually with sufficient threads of new to suggest an unfamiliarity. I mean, let's take, for instance, the motif of breathlessness, the I can't breathe. One of the conditions of existence for many of the Black collectives in England was to do with this question of breathlessness, especially of young Black men in police custody. In the 80s, several police stations across the country had incidents where, young men would be arrested, they would go in, and then, lo and behold, the next day they were found either hanged or, suffocated in some form or another. So I'm very aware of how this motif has been an itinerary in my life. And so, of course, when you hear about the assassination of Floyd, George Floyd, you're immediately attracted to it. Now, of course, what you see there is something very different to what we've been used to. Nevertheless, it has in it that condition, if you will, of breathlessness, of people being forced in a way that you mentioned with Handsworth and that young man who was actually being chased in Leeds, in Chapeltown. It's clear from how he's finally entrapped. The object of the exercise was to deny him breathing space, quote unquote. So the arrest and the capture is both about constraining his body as well as not allowing him room to breathe, quite literally, with the and I mean, I think once you've seen something like that, and once you've made a project about it, you're immediately then woken up to the possibility of its return, So was I surprised about police brutality in America in 2020? No. Was I surprised that someone would die through asphyxiation or the denial of breath? No. Was I surprised by the manner in which that took place on that day? Absolutely. And it's both the shock and recognition of moments that I find fascinating in our work and in history in general. I hope that answers some of your questions anyway. Some of it were more statements that I needed to respond to, and I hope I responded to enough of it.
I'll try to follow on from Ghislaine, actually. I think, one thing everyone's recognized in the work is this very complex renegotiation of history and of memory, also a kind of ceaseless reanimation of archival footage around issues to do with race and colonial violence. And it occurred to me that, it's a rather obvious fact that it makes your practice a screen-based practice as much as a lens-based practice. There's a lot of time working through archives and these kinds of things. And I've been thinking a lot about how everyone has had to adapt during the pandemic, not just in terms of the material infrastructure that we need to support creative practice, but also in terms of, these incredible rebellions and mutinies that have seized so many cities around the planet. And the fact that we receive them more and more through screen-based media of one form or another, and the way that that's led to a proliferation of new kinds of cinematic practices, citizen journalism, etc., and how maybe these things start to constitute a new kind of archive, albeit one that's often captured by the kinds of images I think you're trying to consciously avoid in Handsworth songs. So I just wonder, as you've been in lockdown like everyone else, whether you have, what kinds of reflections you might make around your own practice as an artist, especially with respect to the immediacy of modern media, because I think you started shooting 6 months after the actual riots, and I feel like that 6 months is really crucially important, but in some way less available to us now.
I mean, yeah, great question again. During the period of making Handsworth songs, I mean, I think we went down to Birmingham the first weekend the flashpoint took place, and and did a couple of days of filming, but not a huge amount. So quite a lot in the middle section of Handsworth Song comes from those 2-3 days. But then we kept going back, you know, every other week or so, partly because we didn't have the machinery to make the kinds of current affairs programs that were necessary, equally necessary at the time, you know. And those things, as I think I said in one conversation with you, are usually labor intensive. They happen over a very short period of time, massive research, lots of people go out, and then to bring it all together, some sort of figurehead who fronts the whole thing, either as a presenter or a voice. And they tell you, you know, what has happened in Handsworth, for instance. You know. Well, we didn't have the resources for that. So it was clear that what we needed to do was something a little more reflective. And in truth, one of the things we felt that had to happen was that we needed to commandeer aspects of our practice up to that point, and put them to use in a way that would deliver something. And partly what had been, what had defined the practice, the Black audio practice up to that point, was research. You know, I mean, I think we saw libraries and texts and locations more than we ever saw lenses or brushes or, you know, anything for that matter. I mean, we weren't very product orientated or what's the word? Result oriented. You know, so the first thing that we did, the Tape Slide series, was a 6-parter.
She made 2.
And we released 2, you know, because 2 felt to be ones that justified exposure. You know, Handsworth Songs itself had elements in it from, I mean, things, literally shots in it from research projects that we were doing earlier, you know, that felt appropriate for Handsworth. So, I mean, I've always been committed to that very open-ended practice, which is research-based, not overly committed necessarily to the lens, but knowing that it needs to be deployed at some point. You know, as fascinated by screens, canvases, inventories, libraries, as both spaces for creative practice as well as intervention. So, you know, never put off by the idea that things spent, the things you spent long periods on necessarily have to have a result, you know. So this period's been made for me in some ways, you know. And one of the things I've discovered was that going across the 6 or 7 projects that I've been involved with in the last 7-8 years, each one has generated as much stuff that we left out as the stuff that made it into, you know. So there's a huge amount of work in the background that doesn't make it to, quite rightly too, because a lot of it's not much good, really, but quite a lot of it is also interesting. It's just that they're almost like roads less taking. They suggest rather itineraries and journeys and, you know, possibilities that just didn't need exploring at you know, the point when we made whatever it was, the Stuart Hall project or the Unfinished Conversation. You know, it's just masses and masses.
I'd love to go back to this idea of the source material and, you know, what Adrian was saying, but maybe just to pick up on this idea of the lens and the screen, and the mediated representation, because it seems to me that one of the things that is different about, what shall we call it, the killing, the assassination, the murder of George Floyd, is the witnessing by millions of people of that. And there is an element of Handsworth's song where an older Afro-Caribbean man, resident, I believe, in Handsworth, who's been making cups of coffee for the policemen who've been, you know, policing the streets, then witnesses a young man being handcuffed. And although he's in custody and handcuffed, he's beaten senseless. And then he says, I'd never seen anything like that before. And I think this is a theme as well that emerges repeatedly in your work, John, and is an important thing for us to talk about at the moment, which is the critical importance of bearing witness and of not being able to refute evidence, and doing that in a collective way. Yeah. And that's true also of, you know, all those scenes that are interspliced in the Stuart Hall project of the liberation struggles of South Africa. There's an image that recurs across all three films, really, of police attacking demonstrators with dogs in South Africa, with dogs in Birmingham, Alabama, with fists and riot gear in Handsworth songs. So perhaps we could talk a little bit about this idea, because I think that also has come back in the work of forensic architecture and other practitioners. So we're in a world of media saturation. There's more news than we could possibly absorb. And yet to be able to filter through all that noise and see and bear witness remains a difficult task.
I mean, I've done this pretty much all my life, but I still love it. I still love the being present at moments of revelation, you know, moments in which the self feels a conceptual turn arriving and opts to embrace it, you know. And I guess part of it comes from listening in the very early 80s quite a lot to the arrivants, the stories of my mother's generation, you know, where you feel this phenomenological turn in which people cease to be bearers merely and become activists in their own drama. And part of being transformed into these activists is the realization that they can act upon themselves in a way that make, you know, and you feel it when you see young Black activists on the street. It's like, you know, you call a demo and 100 people turn up when you're expecting 5. And suddenly the awareness of agency emboldens and then fuels further practice and further activity, each one then leading to greater and greater numbers and greater sense of freedom and power. So I've always been interested in that, especially in the beginning when we would interview largely men and women from the Caribbean, you know, in several oral history projects that we did, you know, and you could just feel as you speak to them about the moments of arrival in this country, you could just feel slowly them moving both psychically and narratively from the margin of the discourse to the center of it, you know. So they arrive pretty much hoping to be accepted, and lots of things that happen. Then comes a realization that, of course, it wasn't going to come. And then the next existential step, which is, well, if it's not going to happen, I'd better do it myself, or we'd better do it ourselves. You know, so you see this narrative arc literally as you speak to, and it was so recurring, so motif-like in its regularity, that you knew that this wasn't just a biographical detail. You know, this was somehow being given an insight into a condition, a rites of passage, which is almost universal in its outline, you know, Homeric almost, you know. So I've always been fascinated by that. And I mean, I think when we speak about the act of bearing witness, there's a sense in which there's an echo of that in what I'm saying, you know, except that there was a modesty to our practice. You know, I just wanted to hear people speak about their lives, because I realized it was something they weren't used to. They just weren't used to speaking about their lives, because nobody was interested enough in it to ask them. You know, so many people that I spoke to over the years, it was just to embolden them enough to feel as if their voice and what they had to offer was of value, you know. And it's not a huge step to take to realize that if you could do that for a person or an individual, that one could somehow use the same principles to legitimize stories about a place. You know, it wasn't a huge leap to then think, actually, if we can do it for Trevor Mathison's dad, the most, you know, kind of reticent of men you're ever likely to come across. If you can do it for him, then what would it be like if you took that on as an ambition for a community? Handsworth. What would happen if you decided to do it for, you know, a generation on the March on Washington? You know, so it's a similar practice, but less modest, if you like, as it's developed over the years. You know, but it's the same thing. I'm still interested in just that moment when things or objects or people or moments turn towards me, and in that turn say something both to myself and to themselves about change and transformation.
John, can I ask you to give us some background information on the Black Audio Collective, because a lot of our younger viewers might not be aware of the origins of this pioneering collective?
You know, I'm gonna try and not sound so serious, because I'm aware that every time I say this, I sound like some old man. I am, but I mean, I don't want to sound endlessly like some old man going over something 40 years ago. It was that, but the reason I say that is because 2 days ago I was doing a talk with somebody about the Scarlet Cinema, which was a cinema in the centre of London, in the area called King's Cross. And that was there when I came back from university in '82. It was the Rep Cinema going till about the mid-90s. And the nucleus of Black audio loved that cinema. We used to go there like all the time. One, because it was cheap. It was one of the cheapest places to spend an evening, especially the all-nighters. I think you paid something like £1.50 and you could stay all night watching all kinds of films. But the sense that in doing this, we were developing something called a Black film culture was very palpable to us then, you know. And if I was to describe Black audio, that's what I would now try to stress, that sometime between 79 and 82, a group of young cultural activists, or would-be, wannabe cultural activists, met in a variety of educational institutions across Britain, who decided that they would they would do something that might involve chasing the ghost of Black aesthetics, chasing the phantom of Black aesthetics. And at some point between 82 and 84, decided that that chase was best realized through something called a Black film culture. And so we set off trying to find the money to set up a studio that would allow the experimentation around the question of aesthetics, which would then hopefully produce something called a Black film culture to start. And we worked together in that space, quite literally, in the East End of London for about 15 years, moved to Camden for 4 years, between 93 and 97. And by 97, for a combination of reasons. One, because I think by then everything that we thought should happen was already up and running, you know. But two, it just became increasingly difficult to raise the money necessary to keep a collective going. By then, I think being a company was much more preferable to most of the people who were funding us, because collectives, I mean, by definition, and especially ours, weren't, as I said earlier, product orientated. We weren't necessarily trying to make films. We wanted to experiment, to research, and set in motion sorts of processes. That became more and more difficult to find the money to sustain. And so finally in 97, we just decided that it was probably best to close the collectives, which we did. And only after that did a group of us then think, okay, let's go and now try and do this filmmaking thing as a way of earning a living. Because up to then it hadn't been. It'd been one of many things that we did, you know.
John, I think it's important to contextualize what you're saying in two ways, perhaps, as well.
Yeah.
Responding to Hur's prompt about a younger audience and the context in which you began working. One is about the context of a extraordinary coming together of musicians, filmmakers, artists, intellectuals, crowding in around the metropolises of England, young Black people finding their voice, usually first generation children of migrants in Britain. So that's one element.
Yes.
The other thing is perhaps to address this question of the collective, which in recent years, lots of young people are now reinvigorating and forming themselves into collectives, which I find really, really interesting, and reflecting upon the idea of the collective and why it was so many Black artists, Black Audio Film Collective, Sankofa, Visual Stress, how many people brought themselves together across their own differences, complex differences, into collective groupings. And maybe this is too much of a leap, but I wonder if you could say whether you think this is true or not, that there is something about the collective which is also protective, and to be a singular Black-brown body navigating the city, holding up your camera, could be a very provocative act.
Absolutely.
In the eyes of police and others. And so there was a collective shield, as it were, that the collective provided, a sense of possibility of collaboration as well, which of course is something Stuart always did, always worked in collaboration.
I mean, you know, one of the things which I started saying was how much we loved watching films as a group, as a collective. And part of that was about discovering, you know, cinecultural associations from different periods, different countries, who had, collective modes of work. And that was whether it was the Dziga Vertov group in, the Soviet Union, or the ones working in Cuba, the English collectives, left collectives of the early 70s. And, I think there was a larger question of what model, what unit was capable of making change and bringing change about, And one of the striking things we'd noticed that whenever there was a turn, conceptual, political, or cultural, it was always done in the name of a manifesto by some group or another. And these collectives didn't necessarily stay together formally. The Oberhausen group, for instance, of German filmmakers, never became a collective in that sense, but they did come together, in '62 to do that. The same with the Nouvelle Vague of France, or, wherever you looked for possibilities of change, it always seemed to manifest itself around some grouping, a collective one, and secondly around a sort of manifesto, a shared set of assumptions about where the future lies. And it didn't take a huge leap of the imagination to realize that might be because groups have power and powers that individuals simply don't possess. But I think there were also political and demographic, should we say, explanations that one needs to look at. All of us inside the group, had yearned for more Black art, more Black filmmaking, more Black cultural products since our kind of early teens, really since the early 70s. And it became clear as you looked around that there were people who would make a kind of beeline for the center, and at some point will be just mowed down or would disappear, Horace Oveys or Frank Bolins, you just knew there were people who were making successive attempts at storming the Bastille, as it were. And for one reason or another, just hadn't managed it. And so one of the questions we started to then formulate for ourselves was whether the very individual act itself was the problem, whether trying to do it as a person might not be the best way forward. And when you speak about the emergence of the collectives, at the time, there were also filmmakers who didn't want to be part of collectives, if you remember. There were quite a few as well. And we had to fight. It was a series of arguments. I remember being at Cinema Action in the very early 80s, so this would have been 83 maybe, where a huge row erupted between, Black artists in the room about whether or not we should work as collectives and sign up to the then emerging possibility of a Channel 4 agreement that allowed you to make films as a collective. And there were people saying, no, this is just a white plot to derail us. Signatures can't exist unless they came in individual forms. Huge row, and it went on for weeks. So I like stressing the fact that these collectives didn't emerge coincidentally, but I also want to acknowledge that they emerged as a product of agency. It's important to establish now that at the time when the collectives grew in this country, we were in the minority. We weren't the majority of artists or filmmakers who wanted to do things. We were in the minority. And we have been proved right in the sense that we realized then that the signature would last. Even if the individuals in it didn't. We realized then, I don't know how, But fortuitously enough, this was an intuition that the collective signatures will prevail over the individual ones. You know. Sorry, Adrian.
No. So it was an incredible answer. And I think there's a really long discussion around collectives that I think would be really important in terms of the way they're reconfiguring themselves in the present, which would be across every field. I mean, architecture as well as, you know, moving image and etc. But I want to try to connect something that Ghislaine mentioned before around testimony, and connect it to one of the questions from the audience as well. There was an interview, I think it was around the time of Handsworth Songs coming out, and with Paul Gilroy and Jim Pines, and you had a really incredible way of, you answered a question they asked. You said, you know, they asked you what kind of audience the film was for. And you said that if they had asked you only 5 years earlier, you would have said unequivocally it was for a Black audience. But already at that moment, you had a sense that that was somehow not enough. And then you used a really fascinating term to talk about the kind of project of imagining an audience for the work, which was to build alliances between audiences, right? Which already, to me, spoke of a kind of activist charge in the filmmaking. And I want to connect it to one of the questions we've got from Jazz Biapawara, she's listening. And she says, in Handsworth Songs, I was so moved by the scenes of Afro-Asian, especially Punjabi Sikh solidarities. And I was also struck by the complicated scenes with the Punjabi women shunning the camera. I'd love to hear about your sense of those solidarities from the era of Black British activisms and how those legacies resonate or not in our contemporary times.
Yeah, I like nostalgia. Nostalgia is great sometimes, you know, because you are filled with all kinds of elegies. And I mean, all I can say to that is that there was a moment when I couldn't imagine my life as a child of Ghanaian parents, and see that separate from the lives of very many friends I had at the time who were East African Asians. We'd arrived roughly at the same time. We were roughly in the same schools. So this is an existential response to it. Okay? I normally tend not to do this, but I think in this particular case, it's called for. You know, many of whom are still my friends, my best friends, you know, because we shared something, not just here, but we shared something of that dislocation and the violence of that dislocation, you know. And I think you find that that example of association is repeated for different reasons across the country. So people were in formal and informal solidarities because they lived next to each other, or because they worked together, or because their partners knew each other from picking up kids at school. I mean, there were all sorts of associations, formal and informal, that bound those multiple communities together, especially the Punjabi and the African ones, you know. So it wasn't, I'm not aware that there was a time when we had to force this naming those communities as Black down anyone's throat. It felt natural. But I'm also aware that there was a moment sometime in the kind of late 90s when those solidarities started to bifurcate and to come apart, you know. For reasons that I think are both salutary and ones to be mourned, you know, people by the late 90s, we, you know, en masse had been, you know, a post-war project in the making for what, 5-6 decades, you know. I mean, the idea that we would remain almost exactly the same as we were in 49 or 59 or 69 is not really realistic, you know. So I think the complexity of the state we were in and the state we lived in was making impact, having an impact on our lives. You know, people were changing class positions, all sorts of things were happening that over the years made the possibility of Black and Asian as the acceptable way of describing us rather than just Black, you know, or migrants. You know, there are all kinds of political reasons for it as well, but I won't bore you with the detail. I mean,
but has your sense of your audience for your own work then shifted in a commensurate way over time?
Yeah, you know, I mean, the honest answer I can give is that, you know, many of us were the product of multiple tensions. I mean, I started off because I wanted to be an art historian. That was my thing, right? And then at some point discovered that, you know, around about the time of punk, that you could actually make your own films. I thought, oh, maybe we could do that, you know. Then discovered sort of the work of Stuart Hall and cultural studies in the mid to late 70s, and thought, oh, this is interesting. There's a way in which, you know, I've just been talking about myself, what about other people? And so, you know, and those things coexisted as tensions, not just for me, but I think in the whole collective practice. And the simplest way of putting the question of audience down is this. I mean, many of us were persuaded in the late 70s by the return of Bertolt Brecht, in discussions around the cinema. And we were persuaded about the need for having popular forms of address in that moment. And so part of the turn towards television and towards the cinema was in part, and the move away from the art world was in part to try and do that, you know. But it's also important to say that in my head, two things have always happened which have led to the work. I've been a kind of servant of the quotidian. I've been really interested in how objects, narratives, events, and things in the everyday want to speak to me and what they think we could do together, right? And so I went to television and the cinema because I thought that private language will be best realized on those platforms. And I started to pull away from that when I realized equally that these were platforms with already heavily circumscribed understandings of exactly what my role was, and more importantly, the role of the everyday was on those platforms. And so part of what the last decade has been about for me is turning back to trying to be faithful again to my conversations and intuitions with the everyday. And if in the act of conversing with those things, it feels best to be in a museum, then that's where the stuff goes. If it feels best to be in a commercial gallery, that's where it goes. You know, I mean, I'm much more now interested in listening to the things themselves, you know, trying to find ways in which the lives of things can have an existence that does justice to them. You know, I'm tired of doing things the other way around, putting this very small, you know, conceptual cart in front of that very large horse of the project. You know, like, oh, an audience. Oh, so you go to speak to somebody at Channel 4, I don't know, or the BBC, any of the TV stations here, and you say, I want to do something about Stuart Hall. And it's easier for me to say to them, can I have your material, than for me to say, can you commission me to make something for you? It was easier, literally, at that point, you know, to say, I don't want your money. I don't actually even want this to be shown by you, but I do want what you have on him. because I have a feeling we can do things with it. And in the process of doing the things, some of it said, actually, we're not going to work as a multi-screen piece in the gallery at all. So you better think of something else to do with us. And other things said, actually, yeah, you're right. We could maybe do this 3-screen thing with you, you know? So it's listening, being attentive, swearing allegiance to the ontology of things, and being faithful to that, you know?
That's really important. I think it's also important to talk about form.
Yes.
And the radicality of what you and Trevor Matheson and Eddie George pioneered, as well as others like Isaac and Stuart. And I think to connect it up with what you and Adrian have just been talking about how the experience of what Stuart describes as being hinged between the colonial and post-colonial, how the experience of that violent rupture of migration that you described, how those lived experience in the quotidien, in the everyday, that everyday lived experience gives rise to the possibility of new forms of making and new ways of thinking. And I think that's what maybe another of our participants who's asked a question about asking us to look back to the figure of the data thief in a brilliant film, The Last Angel of History, which, you know, mines, as you're saying, mines these archives, and it would be good to come back to the question of the archive. But it is that radicality, you know, I think watching again Handsworth songs, I was really struck by, for me, it becomes metaphorical how, you know, you the soundscape and imagescapes which are created in that film, they are disorientating, they cut and splice between, you know, the most unexpected things that the community of Asian elders who are actually acknowledging that authority and power, you know, doesn't take responsibility, through to, you know, listening in to the Thames TV producer constructing this panel discussion before it even begins, through to, you know, this post-punk riff on Jerusalem, which is in itself this kind of dissonant, disruptive song, you know, poem by William Blake. So this, I just want to make a connection between formal and radicality of what you're doing and of emerging new ways of seeing and thinking.
I mean, one of the, you know, projects that I loved, and I think all of us in the group loved actually, is the Berger Project, Ways of Seeing, you know, because in the course of becoming familiar with Berger's work, and especially that project on art history, you realized that there was this rift, this gulf between what your ambitions were and what it was possible to do at any one time, you know. So for instance, Handsworth songs came about in the moment when we were doing a project on something we called the surplus underclass, you know, because it became clear to us that actually, you know, Britain was moving into this space where the automatic assessment or the automatic assumption that somehow we would be, as children of migrants, needed wasn't the case anymore. You know, our parents were needed, but it didn't seem clear to us that we, along with most other emergent figures in the post-industrial landscape, were going to be useful or necessary or needed, you know. So the project was about precisely that, called Different Desires, when the riots happened. And we tried to do something try to incorporate. And this is where the question of form comes in. At some point, it becomes clear to you that this gulf between you and what you want to do is inescapable and can only be bridged via form, inescapably tied to the question of how. There's no other way. We sat there thinking we wanted to do this. It was impossible to imagine it in the form of a traditional quote unquote documentary. So the very need that we had, the very ambitions that we had, seemed to suggest that some kind of transcendence will be necessary, either of our own expectations or the available forms of address that were available. And I've always kind of understood that. I've always understood that in a way, the implications of our lives required new forms of address, new forms of enunciation. I didn't necessarily, and I don't think any of us know in advance what those forms would be, but you know, I mean, almost in your being, partly because you made friends with outsiderness, partly because you've been allowed to see what margins look like, partly because you've been allowed to be familiar with powerlessness. I don't know, but a combination of stuff, all of which signals difference, had told us generationally, I think, that the only way we were going to get a voice was if we learned something about how voices can be orchestrated, either atonally or harmonically, but something needed to happen. Some of it was in the electroacoustic sense, just imagining everything that you could hear at any one time, and then thinking, okay, for this moment, I think something more chromatic is called for, you know. For this moment, we want something more dissonant, you know, something noise-laden might work. And I'm using all of those as metaphors, if you like, you know, sonic metaphors. Whereas other moments you just think actually a seamlessness might work best here. You know, it just depended on what the ambitions were and how far you felt you were from realizing something you can imagine and feel but not quite see. You know, and the holy grail of it was what made it interesting. That was the Moby Dick. That was the, you know, the thing to go for. You know?
John, can I ask you about, you know, one of the films we screened is the Martin Luther King March on Washington, which is very relevant today. So I was wondering if you could talk to us about how that process happened, since it was made for television.
Yes. It took about 3 years to raise the money, which is just as well, because the March on Washington had a profound effect on my generation. I think most of us remember something about it, either from the day itself or later. And of course, the key soundtrack that came from it, that led so many of us into the civil rights movement, was King's speech, the I Have a Dream speech. I mean, every one of us knew it by heart. Even now, I could probably do the whole thing, well, at least the famous bits by heart. So one of the unfinished businesses that we had, that I felt we had with commemorative television, was to make sure that when its 50th anniversary came around, we could do something. And it was very clear in my mind that this was going to be a televisual address. In other words, we needed a range of voices, and the range needed to be sufficiently highly placed in the story of the march for people to take them seriously. by people, I mean both the commissioners of the thing as well as the audiences. So yeah, it took 3 years to persuade Harry Belafonte and, Sidney Poitier and Diane Carroll and all these other people on the one hand, as well as the TV stations, American, British, and French, to cough up the money to do it. And for me, it always felt like something we needed to do, because even though I knew the story, I hadn't really heard anything from the participants in terms of how it was put together, who they felt were important. I mean, if you told me before we made it that Bayard Rustin, Black, gay, communist, hounded by all sorts of agencies, would have been the key figure for us, for helping to put together the events, I wouldn't have believed it, and yet, as we started to talk to people, that's what it seemed. It seemed as if, yes, there were these big figures, King, and, but on a kind of ground level, on a day-to-day basis, the figure who made it work, who's always just there in the background in all of the interesting pictures from the day, was this man, and that he himself, along with many of the union figures involved, had been trying for decades, since the 40s, to have a March for Jobs and Progress in Washington, So I absolutely loved doing it. It was really, really important, and it's important in ways that are sort of strange, because one of the reasons I also knew about the march was because in my 20s, I was really fascinated with W.E.B. Du Bois. He lived in the last years of his life in a house just around the corner from mine in Ghana. So when I was a wee kid before we left, I remember going past the house and seeing him. And something I read in my early 20s had said that he died on the day of the march, So the march has always had this kind of weird hold on me, because it's like the last sentence of this life I'd admired for so long. And so even though he didn't take part in it, it felt like his swan song almost, and whatever happened, we were going to do it. I mean, I think that's the promise we made ourselves, that whatever happened, even if we couldn't raise the money, we would do something on the march.
We have one question about the film. What is the relevance of San Francisco to the Martin Luther King film?
Okay. Well, several across the country, if you like, people came from across the country to the march. And so we had to decide where we would base ourselves and where we would tell one of the stories from. And it just so happens that a few of the people we wanted to interview were based there. So that's why San Francisco became the focus of the film. But I mean, what you see happening in the film in San Francisco happened in pretty much exactly the same form all over the country. We just didn't have the resources to be everywhere, basically.
Can I ask another question? Sorry.
Yes, of course.
It seems a lot of your films are really relevant at the moment, and I wanted to look back at the work at Black Audio Collective and the films that you did, the Signs of Empire and Images of Nationality, and looking back at the idea of monuments and what's happening around the world right now.
It's such a strange thing to talk about now, because some of the force of the conviction we held that the monument held a key to the debate about the colonial past and colonial civility and identity and so on, wasn't really shared by many people, you know. And we spent a huge amount of time on them. I mean, you know, 3 years we spent on the monument. But I had the feeling that at some point, their importance would become clear, you know, because, you know, when you think about the edifice of white privilege and the forms in which it orchestrates normalcy and propels the status quo, you know, the presence of these monoliths, tangibles, spread across the country, are a kind of alibi for national identity. They're a sort of I wanted to say embodiment, but I don't think that's the case. I think they're as much hiding as they're revealing. They're as much a falsification as they are a truth. And it was very clear then, so that when you look at the beginning of Signs of Empire, and it says in the beginning there was the archive, the trace, the fiction, the descended autobiography, you know, all of those phrases, we were aware that these monuments embodied, inculcated, signified, represented, you know, whatever language you want to use, these multiple languages, they had all of these qualities to them. And they had all of these functions that they were playing. And some narrated histories of exclusion that they were very proud of, very proud to say, yes, you know, I know that in that war that I wasn't the only one. I'm going to say, I'm going to say that I am, you know. And in a microcosm, that seemed to us to be how white privilege worked in the culture. You know, no one, very rarely did someone say to me, oh, I don't think you're capable of doing this, or you shouldn't do this. What they usually said by implication was, listen, I've got this. I can do this on our behalf. You know, we need television, I can make it. You can watch it, I can watch it. We don't need to break things down into molecules and you take care of this. You know, that in essence, that's the key trope of white privilege, right? To act as ballast, you know, as fortification for histories of exclusion, you know, to pioneer, perpetrate and perpetuate those histories. And statues and monuments say that perfectly, more than anything that I know, that these narratives exist and they will continue to exist because they don't really die, to be honest. So that was the fascination with them. I mean, I think in the last conversation I had about monuments, I was saying that what's happened since Signs of Empire, I think, is that a number of writers of color have emerged, some of whom I was in a conversation with the last time, who understand how to situate, you know, icons in certain discourses in a way that feels empowering for younger artists and younger activists, you know. So I'm not surprised that one of the things that kids in Bristol wanted to do was to take down a statue, because now they know those statues are not just innocent. They know that they have power, or they know that the removal of them is a political project, which will have implications for their lives, you know, because you can't, once you realize that you're talking about traffickers and mass murderers and, you know, serial rapists and all kinds of disgusting things that most of these figures are, you know, the question is really not a legal one anymore at all. Before it becomes a legal one, it's a moral one and an ethical one. Why are they still up? What are they doing, populating streets in this country? You know, what next? Hannibal, you know. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, Stuart Hall wrote a seminal text that he wrote in the third text called Whose Heritage, in which he, questioned all this material. And I wonder if I could use that as a segue to come back to Stuart and the Stuart Hall Project and the unfinished conversation, and also the question of the archive.
Yes.
Because those are films made entirely out of archival material.
Yeah, I remember the conversations that led to them, especially the unfinished conversation. I remember, Mark Seeley, myself, and Lena Gopal going to see Stuart and spending, a couple of weeks returning again and again to speak to him about what was to be this project on the Black image, the century of the Black image. And I remember walking home from his house after, I don't know, the fourth or fifth visit or something, thinking, well, actually, his life could do this, and it happened to coincide with the sense from him that he might not be well enough to continue in the form that we were going anyway, as an active participant in this drama, And so at that point, it became a project which was about the Black image, but at the center of which would be this question of how identities come to be. And his life seemed as emblematic and symptomatic of many of the themes and narratives we wanted to unpack as anyone else's. In fact, more so than most people's. So then the question was, can we persuade him to go along with this conceit, and would he be up for it, It wasn't straightforward because the initial proposals I made came in a form that he didn't like, so we had to rethink them again. And slowly we arrived at the idea that this is what it would be. Now, that's one thing. And then the question is how this was going to happen. And there, I tried to do the same thing every time, and it sounds, like pretty, as we say in this country, wanky, but it's true, and that's to be modest in my claims on material, and see myself largely as a guidance counselor, because images are, as I keep saying, they are absolutely narcissistic to their core. They all believe in their, the ontology of their wholeness, right? So their job is in part to persuade things that feel that they are discrete and with no necessary correspondence with something else, to participate in a conversation which something might come up, And that's the case with Stuart's voices, with his images, with, everything said, we are in a world of our own and we like being in a world of our own. We don't necessarily want to be part of another world. But unless you can persuade them to participate, to withhold provisionally any sense of self-containment, and to step out of their sort of ghettos, quote unquote, then conceptually the thing wasn't going to work, And I think at some point, as a working method, there are significant moments when transformations take place, and they can be offered by voices, by noises, by images, whatever. So part of the trick is to just be attentive. Once they've agreed, everything kind of happens really fast. It takes forever to assemble everything, but once they start to agree to talk to each other, it happens very fast. And I think what's required then is agility, a sense of provisionality, and being nimble, and just staying alive, staying awake, and staying in concert with things as they move.
Jump in a bit maybe, because one thing that occurred to me while I was looking through these films again was the way the idea of like what is the work shifts. So I mean, even in terms of the titles themselves, there's a song, a march, and a project. And in other parts of your work, there's chronicles, there's conversations. Hall describes his own work as an intervention. So there's always a sense of an analysis of a balance of forces, and then a positioning in relationship to them. And then I was thinking about the project in the Stuart Hall project, and that resonated for me in so many different kinds of ways. There's the project of you making the film, that's the first one. There's a project of cultural analysis and transformation that he gives birth to. But then also the project of remaking oneself in a new land, which we've all done in some ways as migrants, as children of migrants. And so I wonder if it's too much of a stretch to say, and building on what you were just saying before about sensitivity to kind of everything and staying alert, is whether you'd see your work, your own practice, as a kind of study in different kinds of works.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, it was really nice the way you started off reminding me of all the different words that organize this work. I hadn't really thought about it at all, but I mean, in a way to say that's bad faith, because of course I have thought quite a lot about the way in which many of the titles suggest a kind of provisionality to the practice, and one of them, it's something that I suppose I remembered really from my art history days, as O&A. It just struck me that there are these complicated ways in which moments and movements come into being, and at the heart of them was always disputation of one form or another, and the key words were impropriety and vulgarity. So if you take the 1880s and 90s, all the different movements up to the 1910s, all the different artist movements that came back were all in dispute with somebody about exactly what their propriety was. In fact, most of the time people weren't convinced of their impropriety, and the form the impropriety took for most of the detractors was a form of vulgarity. So I've known for a long time that questions of impropriety and vulgarity are absolutely essential. necessary in the mix. In fact, my main contribution when we met for the Black Art Conference in '82 was to try with all my might to persuade people not to call themselves artists, because that just seemed to me to give the game up too quickly, because what we had to do was to make these guerrilla raids into the conceptual fields of art making without staying too long to be captured by it. And at some point, and so there's always been this uneasiness with definitive naming, namings that suggest completeness, namings that suggest self-containment. I've always been a lot more comfortable with names that gave me a get-out clause, if you like. So call our way, because I'm convinced that the dispute about whether the work is art or television or cinema is necessary for its survival. You know, the ambiguity and the ambivalence that forms part of the conversation was absolutely necessary. If Salman Rushdie is convinced that we're not a documentary, that's great. Because actually, you don't want to be a documentary. You know, what's so special about a documentary? You wanted to see him as if it's your voice, that what happened is something that only you could have done. Yeah?
There's also a politics, isn't there, John, to that provisionality?
Mm.
Because in the way that people want to fix identity, fix experience as something perpetual, unchanging, unevolving,
Yes.
that provisionality is, which also Stuart talked about, is a way of opening up and grabbing the right to be constantly evolving and moving and changing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this is the thing we loved most about Stuart, you know. So when he came to, having invited him to come and watch assemblies of Handsworth songs, when he came, he always had these two qualities which were both absolutely endearing. There was a kind of fastidiousness, you know, like, you know, are you saying this? Let's be clear about what you're saying here. But also a kind of relaxed attitude to form. You know, like we never had a conversation about whether this was going to be a good documentary or not. Never came up. There was a lot about what we wanted to do. Talked a lot about that. But, you know, I mean, you know, and you've got to remember this guy was one of the sort of pioneers of film studies in this country. So he knew a lot about films. You know, he's one of the pioneers of film studies in this country in the 50s. You know, so it's not just some arriviste at the feast of cinema. And that's one of the reasons we wanted him. We wanted him also because of that, you know. And we knew that when he came, the conversation wouldn't get bogged down in the kind of quagmire of convention, you know, this is the right way to say this, that's the wrong way, all that. We never did that, you know. What he was really keen about was that if we were going to say something, we said it and we're clear that that's what we were saying, right? You know, so an example, the woman, the voiceover that you talked about, The Ghost of Other Stories, you know, there are 3 dates in it which are wrong, right? And Stuart being Stuart told us these are wrong. And you could see something happen when we said, yes, we know. You know, because of course, you know, misremembering is part of them. You know, there's no way that, you know, a middle-aged Black woman, working class, is necessarily going to keep 68 and 69 or 64 and 65 in her head. She has no reason to. She's got more important things to do than be chroniclers of racism. You know, but the thing happened, and it happened either in 68 or 69, and she says it, you know. And once he understood that that's what we were doing, it wasn't a mistake. You know, everything was cool.
I'm sorry, John, we're running out of time. We could go on forever. I think it's
That's fine.
really interesting, and a lot of people are asking some questions, but thank you so much for being part of this and allowing us to screen the films with the Africa Institute. Just for the rest of the audience, I'll just explain. Our next program focuses on Malian-American professor and filmmaker Mansha Diawara, and 3 of his films, which are An Opera of the World, Edward Glissant, and One World in Relation, and Negritude, a conversation between Senghor and Wole Soyinka, will be available for audiences as a free live stream for 3 days via the Africa Institute website, starting on Tuesday the 28th, and will be concluded with a webinar on Thursday the 30th of July at 8 p.m. Gulf Standard Time, which is 5 p.m. London time. And it will be moderated by myself and will feature the filmmaker, Mansha Diawara, along with art critic and founder of Savvy Contemporary Berlin, Bonaventure, and writer and filmmaker, Jihan Al-Tahiri. Thank you so much again, John, Adrian, and Jelaine for joining us this evening.
Pleasure. Take care.
Okay.